Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to Focus Hive. Today we will be talking about single sign-on. So in past couple of videos, we've been talking about multi-factor authentication, application programming interface. And in today's session, we will talk about single sign-on. Now, before we dig into the overall workflow and how it works and what are the various participants in an SSO setup, let's look at an example of single sign-on and also discuss as to why single sign-on is important for users. Let's take it away from technology. Let's look at something that is absolutely not related with the tech world, but it's related with people in the tech world. So you look at the image and you are seeing that fancy bands around the wrist of everybody. Does it give you any hint? Well, let's just talk about it, right? So, well, everything that has been implemented or invented within technology gets its birth from the regular life that you and I live. And one of such examples that came to my mind when I was thinking about SSO is like whenever we go to a club or for a party, when we enter the premise at the gate, there is a security guard. There are bouncers who are standing, and they would pretty much frisk you, and then they will either put a stamp on your wrist or they'll wrap a band around your wrist, which kind of tells that you are now eligible to go inside and have a good time. And you're having a good time, you go to your food counter or you go to the drinks counter and you order something. They don't ask you to pay, they don't ask you to show your identity, they don't ask you to prove anything, they just serve you, which means that once you enter a restaurant or a club with the wristband in your hand, it pretty much tells everybody within there that you have been checked and you're authorized to be inside and use the services available. There are different types of these bands they would strap around your wrist, which will sometimes signifies whether you are a VIP or a non-VIP, and based on that you would be served. So that, in my mind, is a very good example of single sign-on. Pretty much you are signed in at the gate, you enter, and whatever you want to access, you can access without having to prove who you are anymore. So, and then once you're out, your session is done. The next day, if you go, you'll have to establish that authentication with the bouncer or the security standing at the gate. They will take your entry and then they will slap the band around your wrist again. Now, blink your eyes and think about technology world where you are in a network, and in that network you have to access multiple applications to do your job. And if you have to keep entering your credentials every time you're accessing a particular file or a resource, becomes annoying at times. And that kind of enables you to have multiple usernames, multiple passwords. And if you're lazy, then you'd have one password for all your usernames for all the applications, making you a single point of failure for security. Right? So to avoid all of that, single sign-on is implemented so that you don't have to go through the hassle of entering your credentials again and again. You don't have to remember your credential for every other application. All you got to do is you got to remember your network credential, log in with your network credential, and voila, you have access to everything else within that network. And that's the beauty of single sign-on. How does that work? What makes it possible? What are the various components that are part of single sign-on? So we will look at the actors as to who are part of single sign-on, right? So single sign-on, basically you'll have three different participants. One is the user, which is probably you who's trying to log in and access resources. So that's number one. And there is an accessory for this user, right? Every user who's trying to access resources over the network will do so by either an application, like you'll log into Slack using Slack application, you'd log into Gmail using a browser. That would become your accessory. That application interface that lets you log in becomes your accessory. And in this case, majority of applications today is available via a browser. So a user with the browser is the number one actor within SSO. The second one is the service provider. What it means is you are the actor, or you are the user who's trying to access some data, file, resource. You're accessing it from someone, right? You're accessing it from service provider. Let's say you're accessing your email. So probably a Gmail would be your service provider, or Microsoft Exchange would be your service provider. So in order to access that service, you need to have a service provider, and that's the second actor or component within SSO. Third one is the one who gets you the authorization. That is your identity provider. That is IDP. This is the new mediator in between you. So one is you, the other one is the service provider. Ideally, you want to access the data. The service provider should be able to give you the data, but security comes in between. Back in the day, the user would go into the service provider and provide credentials, username, password, and say, hey, it's me, give the data. And the service provider will give the data. But since security became important and we needed to have hassle-free life, we wanted to introduce more security. So we made proving ourselves as us a little complex. And because it is complex, it became an hassle. And because it is an hassle, technology has to solve it. And that's where service providers like Identity Service Provider were born. And they came in between and said, hey, Mr. User, don't worry. We are here to solve the problem that you're going through of entering credential multiple times. You don't have to do that. You just have to enter your credential once. We'll give you a certificate that, hey, this dude is certified. This is the certificate I'm giving. So the service provider, give him the access because I told you so, right? That's the job of the identity service provider. There are various examples of it, and we'll take a look at a couple of those examples, right? So just to reestablish the actors, one is the user who's going to access the resource. Two, the service provider who's going to provide the resource. Third, the IDP, the identity provider, who's going to provide the means mechanism to authenticate the user, right? So the service provider will ask the identity provider that this user who's trying to access the data, is he authenticated or not? The service provider will say yes, authenticated, and the service provider will provide the access to the data or resources. Hope that's clear to you. Now moving on, we will look at the workflow. Now over here this is the user, Ravi, me, and I have a browser. All right. Now I need access to my drive, and there are files that I want to access. So I'm going to make a login request, right? So I type in mydrive.com or drive.google.com and make a login request. Now Google will need to identify me, that it's really me who's accessing the data. Now, before we go through that, we need to also understand that how would an IDP provider, right? How would an IDP service provider come into picture. It's a third party. There is no relation between them and me and Google. So that relationship has to be established beforehand. And that is the job of your ID security or the IT team to ensure that they have single sign-on implemented. Now, when you are implementing single sign-on, that is the time when you're pretty much creating this link between your service provider and your IDP, and they have a trust relationship. This is very important because if you don't have SSO configured, which means you don't have any trust with any of the IDPs, then you are not using SSO, and then this workflow doesn't apply to you, right? So this green line, this green dotted line of trust has to be there to start with, right? So your IT team or you yourself, if you're part of the IT team, will have to configure SSO for the application, wherein you would have certain keys, certificates from service provider, and you'll have certain certificates from identity provider exchanged between each other. And then they will know that when Google Drive is being accessed by a certain user of a certain domain, then Google Drive will say, I am not going to authenticate this user. I'm going to ask my IDP to authenticate this user. All right. It's like they have outsourced their authentication to the IDP. So that outsourcing has to happen beforehand. Now, coming back to Ravi accessing Google Drive via the browser. So makes the request. Now Google Drive sees that, okay, Ravi is coming to me and Ravi is coming from a specific domain. And this domain has SSO configured, which means either they are authenticating via Okta, or they are authenticating via Azure, or they are authenticating via AWS SSO, whichever third-party identity provider they are using, right? So then your Google Drive will send the request via the browser. So it's a redirect request. The response to your login request will be sent back to you or sent back to your browser and redirected to the IDP. So just visualize this. You asked Google, give my file. And in order to do so, you put in your username and password. When you do so, Google then talks to your browser and tells the browser to send that authentication request, that username password, to IDP. For this example, let's say Azure AD. It goes to Azure AD from your browser. So now Azure AD is doing an authentication. So Azure AD sees the username and it checks the password and it says, okay, I know this guy. And then it will send a post message. And in this message, it will send a token. This method is called assertion. Now, when the IDP is sending the token, this token is basically information about you to the service provider. And then the service provider is going to validate you using that token and then say, take the data, which means then the authentication is completed here. And once the authentication is completed, I have drawn this green line, very important for us to understand. Once the authentication is established, now if you see 3 token is posted to the service provider, and just before the step 4, while Google Drive is authenticating the user based on the token that has been given, the IDP is also sending a cookie back to my browser saying that, hey, I sent your data to the service provider, and it will create a cookie on my browser and establish a session. We'll come back to it as to why this step is important. Okay. Now, the cookie is set in my browser from the IDP. We'll pause there. Now coming back to my authentication is done based on the token that was received at the service provider, and I get access to the data I was looking for. Now I have to access another file or maybe a different folder within my Google Drive. When I try to double click on it, will I be prompted again for username and password? Ideally, yes, but it doesn't. Why it doesn't do that? Because now Google Drive has created a cookie with me, which means it has established a session, an authenticated session with me. So now, as long as the session is active, I can access whatever I want because I'm now an authenticated user. I am inside the ballroom. And once I'm in the ballroom, I'm authenticated. I have the band in my wrist. I'm going to access all the resources that's available to me. And voila, I'm enjoying my Google Drive. Right? Now, suddenly, I remember that, oops, I have to respond to someone on Slack. So now I will open Slack. So probably just imagine I open Slack. Now Slack is going to take my username and password and send it to the IDP. How does it send it to the IDP? It sends via my browser. It redirects via my browser, right? So the moment the request comes to my browser will say, hey, there's already a cookie established with the IDP, and it will not re-authenticate against, or it will not ask me to re-enter my keys. It will use the cookie and get me access to Slack. That's why it's called single sign-on. So once I get access to a particular application, I establish a cookie and I am able to access all the data within that application. I don't have to re-authenticate again and again till my session lasts. At the same time, IDP had a cookie created to me, which means it has also established a session with me. As long as this session goes on, I can access any application that has a trust with this IDP. That's the beauty of SSO. And that's how SSO authentication kind of works. So what does this for us? What are the protocols that enables SSO to operate? That are basically SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language. It is a XML-based open standard, and it is a standard that enables application to share identity information, which means your IDP, when sending data to service provider, uses this protocol. SAML is mostly used within the corporate environment, like whenever you're in office or any corporate network, SAML will be used. There is another kind of protocol which is OpenID. It's a JWT. It is a JSON Web Token, and and if you see or remember that whenever you're trying to log into any application, it will prompt you, do you want to log in via Google or do you want to log in via Facebook? That's the technology that is using OpenID, and OpenID enables you to use your single account via one application on different other applications. So the method that I spoke about, mostly in the corporate network, uses SAML, XML-based authentication. So this token that was being sent to the service provider, sent in form of XML using SAML protocol. With that, I believe the SSO must be clearer. If you have any questions, please share it with me and I'll be more than happy to respond to you. You know where to connect to me. And please subscribe, like, and share if you have learned something new today, or if you have liked the content. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much, and see you next week again. Bye-bye.